Protests tonight in Ukraine over the firing of a popular military leader. Today, Ukrainian President Zelensky dismissed Mykhailo Fedorov and named a new defense minister as part of a surprise cabinet reshuffle. The move triggered some of the largest protests since Russia's invasion began more than 4 years ago. Demonstrators rallied in support of Fedorov, who gained a reputation as a modernizer of the military. The 35-year-old had only been defense minister for 6 months. After his dismissal, he publicly accused Ukraine's commander-in-chief of dividing the country and of pressing President Zelensky to remove him.
This led to the commander-in-chief, in fact, issuing an ultimatum, as we all know. And instead of figuring out how to defeat Russia, which is the commander-in-chief's job, he figured out how to divide the country where we find ourselves today. And that's a major problem.
And for more, I want to pull in now John Herbst. He's a former US Ambassador to Ukraine and currently Senior Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador, it's good to have you back on the program. You've watched Zelensky manage his wartime cabinet for years now. What signal does this reshuffling, what does it send?
Well, I think Zelensky had an internal problem within his team. There were people unhappy with Fedorov's reforms of the Ministry of Defense, which proved highly effective. Some were unhappy with Fedorov's rising very public popularity. And some were unhappy with Fedorov's tactics in the war. And sadly, they convinced Zelensky that the most able person right now, or one of the most able people directing Ukraine's defense, Fedorov, had to go. And that's an unfortunate step and completely unnecessary, and in fact, it's a step backward.
Well, help us understand what kind of reforms was Defense Minister Fedorov trying to push through that the commander-in-chief objected to?
Well, I don't know if the commander-in-chief objected to any specific reform, but we know that Fedorov cleaned up a not dreadful, but still not wonderful procurement process. He was in the process of cleaning that up. And folks who turned out on the wrong side of procurement decisions were not happy. And some of those people had influence. And also Fedorov's laser-like focus on drones and smart technology to win the war against Russian aggression also did not please some who had a different view of how the war should be conducted. So in the space of 6 extremely effective months, Fedorov accumulated a host of opponents. And they managed to persuade President Zelensky to remove the guy most responsible for the extraordinary success we've seen on the battlefield for Ukraine since April.
So if I understand you correctly, then we've got a defense minister who has come in. He's tried to cut back possible corruption in procurement procedures, which we know Ukraine has been criticized a lot for. And at the same time, he's taking measures that are actually helping further the goals of the war. And he gets fired. This, on the outside, looks very bad.
Well, I think that it's understandably looking bad, which is why you have many thousands of protesters on the streets in Kyiv and other cities. You had I would say, a roughly analogous situation, not quite the same, 13 months ago, when steps were being taken to reduce substantially the autonomy and the effectiveness of 2 anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And then, too, you had many thousands of people protesting. I believe you had some reservations expressed to Zelensky from senior European leaders, and he changed his mind.
Do you think what we've seen in the last 24 hours, does that tell us that there is major disagreement in the country's top leadership over how this war should be fought?
I would say there's clearly been disagreement regarding personnel in key positions and amongst senior leadership. And that, I think, is what has resulted in this decision, which, again, many people in Ukraine thinks is not a good one. And I agree with that.
Our correspondent in Kyiv was speaking with protesters earlier this evening, and what struck me was the fact that these protesters mentioned President Zelensky's name more than any other public figure, and they did not mention his name in a loving or admiring way. Where does President Zelensky, where does he stand in this power struggle? Is his power here in jeopardy at all?
I don't think it's in jeopardy, but I don't think that this decision enhances his reputation. And I suspect he did not fully appreciate that as he made the decision.
Do you think he underestimated the potential for public backlash here? I mean, the size of these is unprecedented, particularly for wartime.
I hesitate to say that clearly now. I think it may be right, but let's put it this way. If protesters are still out in force in a few days, if the decision has not in any way been addressed, then I say, yes, he has underestimated it. Mm-hmm. He is probably hoping it'll blow over after 24 or 48 hours. Mm-hmm. But as someone who's been watching Ukraine closely for 30 years and who was serving at the US Embassy during the Orange Revolution, I think that's probably not going to be, that aspiration or that expectation will not be realized.
What does your years of experience, what do they tell you will probably happen in the next 48 to 72 hours?
Well, I think the demonstrations will continue, and President Zelensky may offer some form of concession, or he may see if he can ride it out, and then we'll be asking the same questions a week from now. Because the Ukrainian public is used to having a say. They don't run things, but when they see things in their judgment going astray, they will make their voices known. And so that's why I don't think they're going to stop protesting a decision, which again, a very large number of Ukrainians think is a bad one.
What kind of concession could Zelensky make? I mean, and could he backtrack here? Could he reinstate?
Yes, he could.
And would you advise him to do that?
This is what happened in June of last year. His decision to seriously weaken NABU and SAPO, the two anti-corruption agencies, he reversed. Simple as that. He could do the same now, or he could take some middle measure and check and see if that ends the great public unhappiness. But I think that this situation we're seeing today will continue unless some serious gesture is made.
Beyond the public discontent that we're seeing right now, what does this mean for what's happening on the front lines? The Ukrainian army has recently reported many successes, as you know. Is that now at stake?
It's essentially the tech revolution that Fedorov has driven that explains Ukraine's success on the battlefield. I mean, that's not the only factor, but that is the key new factor. And what we have in the way of significant but not necessarily overwhelming evidence is that Fedorov's tactics and Fedorov's activity is very popular among troops and officers in the Ukrainian military. So from that point of view, this decision is not a plus. That doesn't mean you can't have similar results even with Fedorov gone. But people in Ukraine and all those protesters on the streets don't understand why a decision was taken to remove him, given his very important role in Ukraine's far better situation today.
It's also hard to understand how this happened when you consider the events of earlier this week. We saw Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission in Kyiv, announcing a deal agreement with Ukraine to help Ukraine build military drones, building on, and I'm quoting her, she was building on the innovative spirit of Ukraine, the winning innovation that the world has seen from Ukraine's military with its drones. I mean, that all goes back to this now fired defense minister, doesn't it?
What you said is correct. And in fact, what I was wondering yesterday was whether or not she had expressed concern to Zelensky about this pending decision. because I do know that several European leaders had called him or contacted him a year ago when Zelensky was considering, neutering the anti-corruption agencies. I suspect she did. I suspect other Europeans have, but I don't know that for a fact. And since we're dealing with a decision that's in the process of being implemented, maybe they did not, which would then have been, I would say, an omission, an unfortunate omission on their parts.
Yeah. Ambassador John Herbst, it's always good talking with you. It's been an eventful week so far, and the week is not over yet. We appreciate your time.
Correct. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I spoke about this earlier with Marina Miron, a military analyst at King's College London. She told us more about the rift between Fedorov and Syrskyi and its impact on the upper echelons of Ukraine's military.
Good evening, Terry. The problem here is not the rift itself, because normally, if we look at military history, there is always tension that can be found at the higher levels of the military. The problem is that this tension has become public, and that is a big concern. And from my understanding, also from Fedorov's own statements, the rift was quite big because you had two competing schools. You had the General Syrskyi school, which was more Soviet style, hierarchical, and the Fedorov school, which was pro-reform, pro-digitalization, a transformation of the armed forces. And what Fedorov was essentially advocating was somewhat similar to what General Zelenskyy was trying to do. And General Zelenskyy was dismissed as well, or resigned, as we remember. And it was a very difficult situation politically back then for President Zelenskyy as well. And so it is not uncommon. What is uncommon about the situation is the fact that that this is in the public media, and people, not just the military, but people, Ukrainian people are aware of it. International press is aware of it, and that is something that is quite damaging for Ukraine.
Well, it is a very public tension that's spilled out now. In fact, it's brought people out onto the streets in Ukraine, protesting and putting pressure on the president. What does that tell us, Marina, about Zelensky's political standing in the country right now?
As far as the political standing is concerned, Zelenskyy is trying to reassert his presidential authority, of course. But we see that in the 5th year of war, and with the entire cabinet reshuffle, we are not just talking about Fedorov, it's an entire cabinet reshuffle that is taking place. And people protesting means that we shouldn't overestimate Zelensky's power, but it indicates that it's very difficult for him to hold the power together because there are so many competing interests.
Talk to us a bit about those interests. And the question being, was Fedorov's reform agenda threatening entrenched interests inside the armed forces?
I don't know in how far his reforms were threatening. There are reports from those in the armed forces, some of whom have resigned as a result of Fedorov's own resignation, who were supporting his projects, namely more drones for the Ukrainian armed forces. We have to go back a little bit. When Fedorov was a Minister of Digital Transformation, he was the one who is allegedly behind getting Ukrainian military the Starlink terminals from Elon Musk. He was the one who also accelerated the Brave One project, and who has been investing heavily into the unified digital battlefield management system, Delta. So there were those who were pioneering this. But there are also those who are more used to Syrskyi's Soviet-style leadership. So we cannot say that half of the military was behind the reforms and the other half was not. In general terms, what we have to understand that military organizations are hierarchical institutions, and they are very reform resistant. They are very averse to reform. So it is imaginable that there wouldn't have been as much popularity as claimed, because what we have are some isolated reports from those who have supported Fedorov, but there hasn't been a survey of the entire armed forces, how they see the removal of Fedorov. And that is something that we have to keep in mind.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, Fedorov is not the only part of the changes that are being made. What might Zelensky be trying to achieve strategically with this cabinet reshuffle?
From my perspective, what Zelensky is trying to do is, again, to consolidate his power and to remove any sort of internal division to such an extent that it is manageable for him. Because from his perspective, if somebody becomes too difficult, and you have just mentioned Fedorov said to Zelensky that General Syrskyi should be removed. And I think these are the kinds of situations that Zelensky is trying to avoid, and he's trying to project some unity in terms of the governing elites. And therefore, we have another cabinet reshuffle. There were previous reshuffles, but the problematic nature of this is that it is very public. People are aware of it. And of course, this is not just potentially undermining the morale of the armed forces, regardless of how they thought about Fedorov or Syrskyi for that matter, but also the general Ukrainian public. And it doesn't send a good message to the West. And of course, it sends a positive message to the Russians, because if they cannot agree on a grand strategy, then it is very difficult for the military to execute if there is no overall cohesion, strategic cohesion, and an overall end state.
So would you say that these internal divisions could be a risk then for Ukraine's war effort?
Potentially, yes, and not the risk that one might think that the Ukrainian armed forces lose the initiative. No, I'm talking more about long-term risks, especially in the Innovation Center. When Fedorov was elected, the Russian side has been commenting on how many positive things that Fedorov has brought to the Ukrainian armed forces. The aforementioned Delta system, for instance, which the Russians don't have, or at least not in the equivalent. And therefore, I think when it comes to modernizing and digitalizing the armed forces, a process might slow. Again, another thing to consider is a lot of domestic drone manufacturers for whom the barriers have been removed by Fedorov. They are also protesting, and they might be sidelined if the Ministry of Defense decides to go for large-scale purchases with well-established companies. Therefore, it might create internal tensions. It might slow procurement for the armed forces, and it might slow the procurement of those things that they need most. And it will depend on which units we're talking about. But since we have seen this emphasis on drones and on the air war by the Ukrainian side, that could have a potentially negative effect in the medium to long term.
Marina Miron from King's College London, thanks for your insights.
Thank you for having me.